The notion that races truly exist not only reinforces and proliferates racist trains of thought, but it provides justification for the continued oppression of minority peoples. As Bonilla Silva has elucidated, it allows privileged groups to assume that the reason for differences, say, between blacks and whites, arise from three impartial and objective conditions. 1. They are the product of market dynamics. 2. These differences are naturally occurring phenomenon. And 3. That blacks' imputed cultural limitations generate these differences. It washes the privileged group's hands of any responsibility, and allows them to maintain the status quo without having to address systemic inequalities that can be rectified with effort. As Stuart Hall wrote in his 1997 piece, Race, the Floating Signifier, besides the fact that even if race really existed, it wouldn't de facto validate one's political beliefs, these differences only acquire meaning when organized into categories. Unfortunately, as he states, the very obviousness of the visibility of race convinces Hall that it functions as a signifying system, a text we can read, which is then difficult to deconstruct as it appeals to the very ways in which our minds interpret and qualify reality. Ian F. Haney-Lopez, in The Social Construction of Race, Some Observations on Illusion, Fabrication, and Choice in 1994, described race as an ongoing, contradictory, self-reinforcing process subject to the macro forces of social and political struggle and the micro forces and effects of daily decisions. Essentially, Haney-Lopez asserts that race is here to stay, but fated to constantly transmogrify. What I'm trying to express by sharing these ideas is that when we assume race really exists, we assume that the differences in skin tone or in any other otherwise insignificant characteristic are associated with and indeed come with other differences in, say, cognition or behavior. However, this is undone by the fact that race is not a constant or permanent construct, but an arbitrary, mutable, and diffuse set of assumptions and perceptions concerning the quality of human beings. It is much better and appropriate to evaluate individuals based on their being individuals, not members of any race, as many race realists themselves are willing to admit. If you are a social constructivist, you've already given race realists half the battle. You're admitting race exists and that physical or genetic characteristics arise from these truly racial lines. Given this logic, it's not much of a leap to the race realist position. It's like arguing that Zoroastrianism is false, but admitting that a higher power must have created the universe. Of course, that higher power isn't necessarily the Zoroastrian god, and there may be various other explanations, but nevertheless you've made a truly nonsensical position seem reasonable. So you can hopefully understand now why, in trying to debunk or counter race realist assertions, social constructivists often actually help to proliferate and lend purchase to their arguments, at least in part. I argue that we need to assess race as a social category. That is, race is not a real thing, but rather the mutable, inconsistent, and self-contradictory evolution of our cognitive tendencies toward categorization and the construction of heuristics upon which we relate to the world. Our collective understandings of race have changed dramatically over time, sometimes between generations in recent years, sometimes faster than that. Perhaps it's important to consider what hasn't changed over time. Race undeniably exists socially, and always has in all likelihood, and this has had significant ramifications for our societies. Our notions of race have always been predicated upon visible cultural differences between groups, and this seems to be the one constant throughout time. Humans always noticed differences in physical features, how could one not? But we did not assume that other differences accompanied these, or at least not most of our ancient brethren believed this. But we should not confuse our tendencies to compare and contrast groups with there being real differences between our populations. What do I mean by real differences? Are there not a variety of skin tones, eye shapes, and hair textures? Are these not real? Undoubtedly, these features exist. I would argue that a difference only becomes real in the sense I'm purporting when it transcends our social constructions of significance. What I mean is, and we'll visit this in a future episode, our abilities to communicate, cooperate, procreate and relate to each other do not seem to be, in the least, compromised by our superficial genetic and phenotypic variations, but rather are compromised by our socially predicated relations to each other. The extremely minor genetic and phenotypic variations our populations exhibit today do not seem to hold any group back from performing in the modern world. It would appear to me that race could be discerned from significant genotypic and phenotypic variation alone, and would therefore be easily discovered by other means of testing, as has been done with chimpanzees, for instance. This notion is exactly why race realists attempt to construct definitions of race which feature visible, perceptible differences, and attempt to link these to characteristics like IQ, behavior, and genetics. They misunderstand what race is in very basic terms, and their definitions circle about nothing more than a desperate and gross exaggeration of variation in our species and a usurpation of evolutionary science. Race in humans is not comprehensible nor coherent if only assumed in genetic or physical terms. In fact, it's not supported. When we mention physical variation in our species, we're commenting on the truly fantastic emergent properties of our genes, not race. I suppose the need arises then that we should define what race is in actual terms and explain why social constructivism and race realism are rooted in the same misunderstanding of biology. Meet me at part 4 and join me in diving into race as a scientific concept.